Friends, what is the point of the resurrection? That may sound like a very strange question to ask on Easter morning. Surely the point is obvious, people might say. And yet, when we listen carefully to the different voices of the New Testament, it becomes a little less straightforward. Paul the Apostle, our earliest Christian writer, speaks of resurrection as a transformation, a kind of metamorphosis into a spiritual body, not simply flesh and blood brought back to life. And his encounter with the risen Christ was not with a resuscitated physical body, but with a voice and a light on the road to Damascus. The Gospel of Mark, the earliest gospel, written after Paul's writings, ends with an empty tomb and a promise, but no appearance of the risen Jesus at all. The Gospel of Matthew, written about 20 years later, gives us two brief, mysterious, powerful encounters, but not overly explained. And the later Gospels of Luke and John, the stories become more physical, more tangible in their descriptions of the resurrection of Jesus. And then in Matthew's telling of the resurrection story, there's a strange detail that no one else includes. It's the earthquakes. At the moment Jesus dies, the earth shakes, rocks split open, tombs are opened. And again, on Easter Sunday morning, the earth shakes once more. Why? If this was simply about reporting events, surely all the Gospels would mention something so dramatic. But Matthew alone tells it this way, which suggests he is not only describing something that happened, he's telling us what it means. For Matthew, the death and resurrection of Jesus are not small, contained religious moments. They are earth-shattering. They shake the very foundations of reality. The world as we have known it, our assumptions, our certainties, our systems, they're being shaken loose. It is as though something has come into the world that doesn't fit and cannot be contained. And that brings us back to the question, what is the point of resurrection? Perhaps it is first of all this, that resurrection is the announcement that death is not the end, that life is stronger than death, that what we see is not all there is. For people who live with the quiet fear that everything ends in loss, that everything fades into nothing, resurrection speaks a word of deep freedom. You do not need to live in fear. Life is larger than you imagined. The story is bigger than death. And perhaps that is why Matthew's telling of the story, in his telling the first words of the risen Christ to the woman, are the words, "Do not be afraid." That's important, but it's only part of it. Because if resurrection were only about life after death, it could remain something distant for many people, something for the future. Matthew will not let it stay there, because the one who is raised is this Jesus, the one who taught love of enemies, the one who refused violence, the one who ate with prostitutes, tax collectors, and sinners, the one whose radical love challenged both religious and political power, the one who embodied a way of being human that seemed to many naive, impractical, even dangerous. And what did the world do with that way of being? It rejected it. It silenced it. It crucified it. Why? Because the way of Jesus exposes something. It exposes how much of our world is built not on love, but on fear, not on truth, but on control, not on trust, but on anxious grasping of the ego. And so here is the second possible meaning of the resurrection. It is God's yes to the way of Jesus. Where the world says this way cannot work, resurrection says this is the way of life. Where power says strength comes through domination, resurrection says true power is revealed in self-giving love. Where fear says protect yourself at all costs, resurrection says, in the words of Jesus, lose your life and you will find it. And now perhaps we begin to understand the deeper significance of the earthquakes in the storeroom. If Jesus truly lived in tune with the deepest reality, if his way is aligned with the very grain of the universe, then everything that stands against that way is in some sense unstable, out of alignment, built on shaky ground, as Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. And when the deeper truth is revealed, fully revealed in the crucifixion and resurrection, then the ground begins to move, the rocks split, the tombs are opened, the old world begins to crack. Because the resurrection is not just about what happens after death, it is also about what happens when truth meets illusion, when love meets fear, when the way of Christ meets the ego-driven structures of the world. Something has to give. And Matthew tells us that it is the world as we have known it that begins to tremble. And this is why resurrection is not just comforting, it could also be regarded as deeply unsettling, because if it is true, if the way of Jesus is not just a beautiful ideal, but touches the deepest truth of reality, then it calls everything into question. The way we live, the way we relate, the way we build our lives around control, status, security. All of it stands on ground that is not as solid as we had thought. And yet this is not a message of destruction. It is, in fact, a message of liberation, because what is being shaken is not what is real, but what is false. It is what cannot ultimately endure, so that something deeper, truer, more alive can emerge. And this is where Matthew leads us. The women meet the risen Christ, and what are the first words they hear? Do not be afraid. And then go and tell. And at the end of the gospel, just a few verses later, Jesus, the risen Christ, says to his disciples, go and make disciples. This is the point of resurrection. Not simply that Jesus is alive, but that a new way of being human has been revealed as true. That love is stronger than fear. That life is stronger than death. And that we are now invited not just to believe it, but to live it. To become disciples of this risen life. And perhaps that's why Matthew describes the woman falling down in worship and holding on to his feet. What does worship actually mean? The Old English comes from two root words, worthship or worthshape, and it means to give worth or value to something. As they fall in worship and hold on to Jesus' feet, they are affirming that in Jesus, they have seen their highest value, holding on to his feet. To worship Jesus is to declare that in Jesus we see our highest worth, our truest, our highest potential as well. To see in Jesus what is most valuable in life. To worship is to dedicate oneself to the way and the values of Jesus. It's not so much to put Jesus on a pedestal and constantly say how much better he is than us. It is to commit ourselves to becoming like Jesus, for the Christ-like potential in us to be revealed, becoming who and what Jesus is. It is to put his teaching into practice. And perhaps that takes us to the symbolism of the woman grasping Jesus' feet. Firstly, it is a sign of deep respect in the East, particularly in India, to greet a great spiritual teacher One bends down and touches their feet. It's a sign of humility, but also more than that, it's a symbolic expression of a desire to follow in the footsteps of the teacher. Feet are the means by which we walk through life. They represent the path we walk. To grasp Jesus' feet is symbolically to affirm the way of Jesus. The resurrection message of Matthew is not just a message of admiring Jesus. It is, in fact, a call to follow, to be transformed inwardly. What is the meaning of the resurrection for Matthew? It is a call to walk in the way of Jesus and to make that way of Jesus our own. It is to make his values and teachings our own, so that the way of Jesus lives on in us. Love of enemies, being true to our word, loving our neighbors as ourselves, reaching out in compassion to the poor, the hungry, the thirsty, those in prison. And when that happens, the earth is once again shaken. And so perhaps the question for us this Easter is, where in our lives is the ground beginning to shake? Where are the old certainties cracking? Where is the way of Jesus quietly, persistently unsettling the way we have learned to live? Because that shaking is not the end. It is the beginning of resurrection. Amen. God bless. Just some food for thought today on Easter Sunday. Amen.